Tonight's story comes from careful study and steady dedication. Every element has been deliberately chosen to create a relaxing listening experience while respectfully presenting the events. This channel aims to bring attention to cases that time almost allowed to be forgotten. He drove the same highways you drive every day, hauling freight, waving at passing cars, stopping at the same gas stations where families buy snacks and stretch their legs. And for over 3 decades, nobody knew that somewhere beneath that ordinary, unremarkable life, he was carrying the weight of dead women like cargo. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover some disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story The Highway Reaper, the dark double life of Clark Perry Baldwin. Now let's begin. They gave them names the way you name a ghost: Bitter Creek Betty, 90 Jane Doe, because nobody came looking for them, and for 30 years nobody came looking for him either. He slept in his own bed. He waved to his neighbors. He pushed a shopping cart through Walmart. And while the bodies of his victims lay frozen in the cold ground of Wyoming and the warm clay of Tennessee, Clark Perry Baldwin lived freely, breathed deeply, and trusted that the highway had swallowed his secrets whole. He was almost right, almost, because the dead have a way of waiting, and science has a way of finding what the earth tries to hide. What follows is not just a story about a killer. It is a story about the women he erased, the families that never stopped searching, and the investigators who refused to let silence win. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There is something about long stretches of American highway that swallow people whole. Miles of flat land, the hiss of tires on asphalt, the low rumble of an 18-wheeler engine cutting through the pre-dawn dark. And behind the wheel of one of those massive rigs, invisible in plain sight, was a man named Clark Perry Baldwin. He was born on August 22, 1961, in Charles City, Iowa, a quiet Midwestern town where the biggest sounds were church bells and the creak of a grain elevator. His parents, Lawrence and Betty Baldwin, were described by those who knew them as decent, loving people. Clark grew up surrounded by the kind of steady, unassuming Midwestern normalcy that leaves very little room for the dramatic. There were no documented signs of early violence. No neighborhood pets went missing. No teachers pulled his parents aside with worried expressions. He was, by most external accounts, an unremarkable boy growing into an unremarkable man. And that ordinariness would become his most dangerous weapon. In the early 1970s, the family relocated to Nashua, Iowa, a small town of just a few hundred souls tucked in the northeastern corner of the state. Clark attended Nashua Plainfield Junior-Senior High School, walked its hallways, sat in its classrooms, and graduated in 1979 without incident. After graduation, he found his calling, or rather, his calling found him. He became a long-haul truck driver for a company called Martin Transport, and in doing so, he stepped into a world that offered him something no small Iowa town ever could: unlimited movement, unlimited anonymity, and unlimited access to some of the most vulnerable people in America. The open road transformed Clark Perry Baldwin. Behind the wheel of a commercial semi-trailer, he was no longer a small-town boy from Nashua. He was a man with a key to the entire country. He traveled from Tennessee to Wyoming, from Iowa to Texas, from Illinois to Missouri, crisscrossing the nation in a vehicle large enough to serve as both a killing floor and a getaway car simultaneously. And during his off hours, he gravitated toward a particular world that lived in the shadows just off those highways. The world of truck stop prostitutes, pimps, and the desperate, the displaced, and the forgotten. These were people who moved through America's margins, whose disappearances rarely generated headlines, whose names sometimes never even made it into official reports. They were precisely the kind of people that a predator of Baldwin's particular patience and cunning would choose to target. It is important to understand what kind of man Clark Perry Baldwin appeared to be in everyday life, because it is the contrast between that appearance and the reality of what he was doing that makes this case so deeply unsettling. By all accounts from those who knew him personally, he was described as a gentle giant. A big man with a soft manner, reportedly generous to his friends and pleasant enough in company. Someone close to him during this period later struggled openly with the dissonance between the man she thought she knew and the monster the evidence revealed him to be. This is a pattern that investigators who study predatory violence recognize immediately. It is not coincidence. It is design. Men like Baldwin cultivate a persona of gentleness and warmth precisely because it disarms people. It lowers defenses. It opens doors, sometimes literally. And then there were the whispers. There were always whispers. At some point during their relationship, Baldwin's ex-wife told police something that should have turned the world upside down. She said that Baldwin had once bragged to her about killing a woman. Specifically, that he had strangled a girl out west and thrown her body from his truck. Let that sink in for a moment. He did not confess in shame. He did not break down under the weight of guilt. He bragged. He spoke about it the way a man might recount a minor incident on the road, casually, as if the life he had taken was little more than an inconvenience disposed of properly. His ex-wife reported this, and somewhere in the machinery of law enforcement, that report was noted, filed, and failed to produce the result it should have. Baldwin kept driving. It was not until 1991 that the first body connected to his violence appeared, though investigators would not know for nearly 3 decades that it was his hands that put it there. On March 10, 1991, a woman was found dead on the side of Interstate 65 near Spring Hill, Tennessee, approximately 30 kilometers south of Nashville. She lay in a ditch off the shoulder of the road, discarded like refuse beside a highway that tens of thousands of people used every single day. She was identified as Pamela Rose Aldridge McCall, 32 years old, from Topping, Virginia. She had been raped, she had been strangled, and she had been 5 months pregnant at the time of her death. The weight of that last detail is not something that language can fully carry. Pamela McCall was not just one victim. She was 2. She was a woman with a life, a history, a family that loved her, and a child who never had the chance to draw a single breath outside of the womb that became a tomb. She had a name, and the child she carried, later named Angel in documentation, had the right to a name too. Both of them were stolen. Both of them were left in a ditch. And both of them waited there in the silence of a Tennessee spring while Clark Perry Baldwin kept driving. During the investigation of Pamela's murder in 1991, evidence was collected at the scene, including traces of semen found on her clothing. It was crucial biological evidence. But the technology of 1991 could only go so far, and without a match in any existing database, the DNA sat in storage like a message in a bottle, waiting for someone to be ready to read it. The investigation stalled. The case went cold. Pamela McCall and her unborn daughter Angel were added to the long, sorrowful ledger of unsolved American homicides, and the man who killed them drove away into the vastness of the country. Almost exactly 1 year later, the highway gave up another body. March 1, 1992, a female truck driver pulled into the Bitter Creek rest stop on the west side of Interstate 80, approximately 40 kilometers east of Rock Springs, Wyoming. What she found there shattered the quiet of that bleak Wyoming morning in a way that she would likely never fully recover from. Lying face down on the ground was a young woman. She was dead. She bore strangulation marks on her neck. She had been left there like trash beside a road that stretched in both directions into nothing but open land and cold sky. She had no identification. Nobody came forward to claim her. Nobody filed a missing persons report that matched her description. And so investigators gave her a name of their own making, a name that was as lonely as her end. They called her Bitter Creek Betty. 6 weeks later, on April 13, 1992, Wyoming Department of Transportation workers performing routine checks of the right-of-way fence along Interstate 90, approximately 15 miles north of Sheridan, some 400 miles from where Bitter Creek Betty had been found, discovered another young woman's body in a roadside ditch. She was small and slight, described as white, somewhere between 16 and 23 years old, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighing around 121 pounds. She had been raped, She had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head, and she was pregnant, approximately 10 weeks along at the time of her death. Like Bitter Creek Betty, she had no name. Nobody came. Nobody reported her missing in any way that helped investigators connect the dots. She became I-90 Jane Doe, and she lay in that ditch north of Sheridan, unknown, unnamed, and unavenged, for 33 years. 2 nameless women, 1 named woman and her unnamed child, 3 states, 3 crime scenes, 1 killer still driving. Back in Iowa, the whispers continued. In 1992, Baldwin's name surfaced briefly during a homicide investigation in the state. A convenience store clerk named Rhonda Knutson, 22 years old, had been beaten to death during the overnight shift at a Phillips 66 truck stop near Williamstown, Iowa, a short drive from Nashua, where Baldwin was living at the time. She had suffered catastrophic blunt force trauma, but, unlike the other victims, she had not been sexually assaulted. A coworker who discovered her body reported that 2 truck drivers had been seen entering the store shortly before her death. Police composite sketches were produced and distributed to approximately 1,500 truck stops across the country. One of the men in those sketches bore a striking resemblance to Clark Perry Baldwin. He denied any involvement in Knutson's death. He was never charged. He kept driving. In Texas, in February of 1991, the same year Pamela McCall was murdered, a 21-year-old woman named Mary and Newton climbed into Clark Perry Baldwin's truck somewhere in Oklahoma, hoping for a ride south toward a fresh start. What happened inside that truck instead was an act of brutality that Newton would carry with her for the rest of her life. Baldwin struck her, bound her hands and mouth, raped her, and then attempted to choke her to death. She survived remarkably and managed to turn a gun on him. When Texas Ranger Gary Henderson caught up with Baldwin days later, Baldwin gave a partial confession. He admitted he had forced sex on Newton. He admitted he had bound her. And then, because the machinery of justice sometimes fails in ways that haunt the living and the dead alike, he was released pending grand jury proceedings. He was never prosecuted. By 1997, Secret Service agents raided his Springfield, Missouri apartment after discovering he was producing counterfeit currency. A crime that resulted in no apparent long-term consequence significant enough to keep him off the road. And through all of it, through the bodies and the whispers and the confessions and the close calls, Clark Perry Baldwin kept his secret, kept his route, and kept his freedom. For a while longer. The most devastating thing about the women Clark Perry Baldwin killed is not just that he killed them. It is that for years, decades, in some cases, the world did not even know their names. Pamela Rose Aldridge McCall was 32 years old when she died. She had a face, a voice, a laugh that people who loved her would have recognized anywhere. She had places she was known, people who would have called looking for her. And indeed, her identity was established relatively quickly. She was from Topping, Virginia, and her death, while unsolved, was at least mourned by people who knew her as Pamela. Her unborn child, the daughter she carried 5 months into what should have been a journey toward new life, was given the name Angel by those who documented her case. A small act of humanity extended posthumously to someone who never had the chance to be anything other than a victim. But the women in Wyoming had no such comfort extended to them in the years immediately following their deaths. Bitter Creek Betty, 90 Jane Doe, these were not names. They were coordinates. They were placeholders. They were what happens when a young woman dies in a place where nobody is looking for her, in a time before the digital age made the missing slightly harder to disappear. Irene Vasquez, the woman who would ultimately be identified as Bitter Creek Betty, was a young Hispanic woman found lying face down in that Wyoming rest stop in March of 1992. She had strangulation marks on her throat. Her body bore the physical evidence of violent assault. And then she was cataloged and stored in the cold architecture of an unsolved case, while the man who had pressed the life from her body drove on toward whatever came next. Cindy Arlene Estrada, the young woman who would eventually be identified as I-90 Jane Doe, the second Wyoming victim, was 21 years old. She was from Torrance, California, with the sun-bleached hair that led investigators to speculate for years that she might have originated from somewhere in the American South. She had been 10 weeks pregnant when she died. She had been raped, beaten with blunt force, and left in a roadside ditch in the kind of cold that Wyoming in early spring delivers with merciless efficiency. And she remained unnamed, unknown to the public, unknown to justice, for 33 years. Think about that number. 33 years. Long enough for a child born the year she died to grow into a middle-aged adult. Long enough for the world to change completely around the frozen fact of her death. Long enough for Baldwin to convince himself, with some reasonable degree of confidence, that he had gotten away with it. The families of these women, those who knew their names, those who searched for them, those who eventually learned what had happened, existed in a particular kind of purgatory during those decades. For Pamela McCall's family, there was the grief of knowing she was gone but not knowing who had taken her. For Cindy Estrada's family, there was something perhaps even more unbearable. Not knowing for 33 years whether she was alive somewhere, living under a new name, perhaps choosing not to reach out. The not knowing is its own species of torment, one that Baldwin inflicted not just on his direct victims but on every person who had ever loved them. Meanwhile, across those same decades, investigators in Tennessee, Wyoming, and Iowa were quietly, persistently refusing to surrender. In Tennessee, the cold case unit assigned to Pamela McCall's murder kept the evidence alive. In 2019, nearly 30 years after her body was found in that roadside ditch near Spring Hill, a cold case investigator submitted the original evidence for modern DNA analysis. What came back from the lab was a genetic profile of the killer, sharp and detailed in the way that modern forensic science allows. That profile was entered into national databases and matched immediately to a DNA profile that had been developed years earlier in connection with the 2 Wyoming deaths. The murders, which had been investigated independently for nearly 3 decades, were suddenly, undeniably connected. The same man had killed Pamela McCall in Tennessee in 1991. The same man had killed Irene Vasquez at Bitter Creek in Wyoming in 1992. The same man had killed Cindy Estrada near Sheridan later that same year. 3 murders, 2 states, 1 killer. But who? The DNA profile was compelling evidence of what had happened. It was not yet evidence of who had done it. And this is where the story of Clark Perry Baldwin's capture intersects with one of the most remarkable and increasingly common investigative tools of the modern era: genetic genealogy. Investigators turned to the publicly available commercial genealogy databases that millions of ordinary Americans had used to trace their family histories, discover distant relatives, and connect the dots of their ancestral lines. Using the DNA profile extracted from the crime scenes, genealogists working with law enforcement identified a partial match, not to Baldwin himself, but to a relative of his who had uploaded their own genetic data to one of those databases. This single match opened a door. Investigators worked outward from that match, mapping family trees, cross-referencing names and ages and geographic histories, narrowing the circle of suspects with the patient precision of people who had been waiting 30 years and were not about to rush the final mile. The circle contracted around a name: Clark Perry Baldwin. He was the right age. He had been a truck driver for Martin Transport during the precise years when the murders occurred. His routes overlapped with every crime scene in a way that could not be dismissed as coincidence. His ex-wife's old report, the one where she said he had bragged about strangling a woman and throwing her from his truck, was pulled back into the light. Investigators did not move immediately. They watched. They waited. They followed Baldwin through the mundane rhythms of his daily life in Waterloo, Iowa. An aging man in his late 50s who pushed a shopping cart through the aisles of Walmart, who put out his garbage bins on trash day, who, by all visible external evidence, was simply an old man living quietly in an Iowa city. And they collected his garbage. Over a period of several weeks in early 2020, investigators intercepted the trash bags that Baldwin left out at the curb and the shopping cart he used at Walmart, extracting from the discarded food scraps and other refuse the one thing they needed: his saliva, his DNA. The biological signature that would either exonerate him or destroy him. It destroyed him. The analysis confirmed with scientific certainty what months of genealogical investigation had suggested. Clark Perry Baldwin's DNA matched the profile found at the murders of Pamela McCall in Tennessee and the 2 women in Wyoming. The man who had driven those highways for decades, who had breathed free air and slept in his own bed and told no one what he had done. He was the man who had pressed his hands around those women's throats. He was the man who had raped them and left them in ditches and rest stops and roadside gullies like things rather than people. On May 6, 2020, investigators arrived at his home in Waterloo. Clark Perry Baldwin, aged 58, was placed under arrest. The charges were substantial. 2 counts of murder in Tennessee for the deaths of Pamela McCall and her unborn child. 2 additional murder charges filed in Wyoming, 1 in Sweetwater County for Irene Vasquez, Bitter Creek Betty, 1 in Sheridan County for Cindy Estrada, I-90 Jane Doe. When the arrest was announced publicly, law enforcement officials were careful but pointed in their language. Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Special Agent Mike Krapfel confirmed that investigators were already in contact with several other state agencies who had reached out with similar cases. Women found dead near highways, bearing similar injuries, during time periods that overlapped with Baldwin's known routes. A woman named Jody Ewing, who operated the Iowa Cold Cases website and had spent years cataloging unsolved homicides, provided investigators with a list of more than 24 killings since 1980 that could conceivably fit Baldwin's pattern. Women who had been beaten, strangled, stabbed, and left in ditches near major roadways across multiple states. Among the most striking of these potential connections was the case of Tammy Jo Zawicki, 21 years old, a student at Grinnell College in Iowa. In August of 1992, she was driving from Evanston, Illinois, back to college when her 1985 white Pontiac T1000 broke down on the shoulder of Interstate 80 in Illinois. A witness reported seeing a girl matching Tammy's description on the roadside, talking to a truck driver. 9 days later, on September 1, 1992, her body was found wrapped in a red blanket along Interstate 44 in rural Lawrence County, Missouri. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed 8 times. She was 21 years old with her whole future written out in the internship letters she had been mailing to sports information offices, dreaming of a career after graduation. Her mother, Joanne Zawicki, told Dateline NBC that she thought about her daughter every single day. She just couldn't wait to see what would happen tomorrow, Joanne said. Whoever did this took it all away from her. Investigators looked hard at Baldwin in connection with Tammy's case. They ultimately backed away from pursuing that connection when the evidence did not conclusively support a charge. Baldwin went to his grave without confessing to Tammy Zawicki's murder, and her case remains officially unsolved. There was also Rhonda Knutson, the 22-year-old convenience store clerk bludgeoned to death at her truck stop workplace in northern Iowa in 1992, whose composite sketch bore that unsettling resemblance to Baldwin. He denied involvement until the end. The man who had bragged to his ex-wife about killing a woman out west was now sitting in the Black Hawk County Jail in Waterloo, Iowa, awaiting extradition. The highway had kept his secrets for 29 years, could keep them no longer. The years between Clark Perry Baldwin's arrest in 2020 and his eventual trial in 2025 unfolded with the particular, grinding slowness that the American legal system sometimes inflicts upon those who have waited longest for answers. For the families of Pamela McCall, of Irene Vasquez, of Cindy Estrada, for the investigators who had spent careers on these cases, the wait was another form of the cruelty that Baldwin had already imposed on them. Justice, when it finally comes in cases like these, tends to arrive like a winter sun. Real, but offering less warmth than you had spent years imagining. The Tennessee case was the first to move toward trial, and it was there that the full architecture of what Baldwin had done was laid out for a jury and for the world. Pamela Rose Aldridge McCall had been found on March 10, 1991, on the shoulder of Interstate 65 near Spring Hill, Tennessee, a stretch of highway that cuts south from Nashville through the rolling Middle Tennessee countryside. She was in a ditch. She had been raped. She had been strangled. The skid marks found directly in front of where her body lay told investigators something crucial. They were consistent with an unloaded tractor-trailer rig locking up its brakes on the roadway, a massive vehicle stopping abruptly in the dark, its driver depositing something at the roadside before driving on. Those skid marks were preserved in evidence. They would matter enormously. The DNA collected from Pamela's pantyhose during the original 1991 investigation, the trace of biological material left behind by her killer, had waited nearly 3 decades in evidence storage before modern technology and modern determination brought it into the full light of forensic scrutiny. When it was finally matched to Baldwin's profile in 2020, it represented one of the more powerful arguments for the continued investment in preserving old evidence. Cold cases do not die. They wait. In the courtroom, prosecutors worked methodically and with evident purpose. They presented the DNA evidence. They presented the skid marks. They presented the testimony of Mary and Newton, the Kansas woman who, in February of 1991, had climbed into Baldwin's truck in Oklahoma hoping for a ride south and had instead found herself beaten, bound, raped, and choked within an inch of her life in the Texas Panhandle. Newton had carried the weight of that night for 34 years. She had survived. She had somehow, against the particular gravity of that kind of violence, kept living. And when prosecutors asked her to take the stand, she did. Assistant District Attorney General Pam Anderson described Newton's testimony as doing wonderfully, which, considering what Newton was being asked to relive in that courtroom, stands as one of the most understated assessments imaginable. Newton's testimony was allowed into evidence not because her attack was directly connected to the murder charge, but because it established a pattern. It showed the jury what Clark Perry Baldwin was capable of, what he had done to another woman in the same general time frame, and how systematically and deliberately he had operated. The judge granted the prosecution's special request to include this testimony. The judge did not allow the jury to hear about the 2 Wyoming victims during this trial. Those cases would come later, in a separate jurisdiction. The final prosecution witness was Gary Henderson, the retired Texas Ranger who had interviewed Baldwin in the days following his assault on Newton. Henderson laid the foundation for a key piece of evidence, a typed statement from Baldwin himself, given in February of 1991, in which Baldwin had admitted, in his own words, preserved in a transcript, that he had forced sex on Newton at some point during their encounter, and that he had bound her. A partial confession, offered and then apparently forgotten by the machinery of prosecution in Wheeler County, Texas, in 1991. It had not been prosecuted then. It was not forgotten now. The jury heard it all. The DNA, the skid marks, the survivor's testimony, the partial confession, the decades of avoidance and ordinary life and careful concealment. And on May 2nd, 2025, 34 years after Pamela McCall's body was found in that Tennessee ditch, 34 years after her unborn daughter Angel died before she ever lived, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Clark Perry Baldwin was convicted of the murder of Pamela McCall and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was transported to the Maury County Jail in Tennessee to await the next legal process. Extradition to Wyoming, where Sweetwater County Attorney Danny Aramusp and Sheridan County Attorney Diana Bennett had both filed first-degree murder charges in connection with Irene Vasquez and Cindy Estrada, respectively. Wyoming had been waiting. Wyoming was ready. And then, in the span of a few days, everything changed. On July 17, 2025, just over 2 months after Baldwin's conviction in Tennessee, investigators finally achieved the identification that had eluded them for 33 years. Using a DNA breakthrough that matched biological data from the victim to her biological mother, the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation publicly identified I-90 Jane Doe. Her name was Cindy Arlene Estrada. She was 21 years old when she died. She was from Torrance, California. She had been 10 weeks pregnant. She had been in Wyoming in the early months of 1992, in a truck, in the presence of a man who left her in a roadside ditch north of Sheridan and drove away. For 33 years, Cindy Estrada had been a sketch on a flyer, a description in a database, a height and weight and hair color and a question mark where a name should have been. And now, at last, she had her name back. Too late for justice in a courtroom, but her name, at least, was hers again. The day after Cindy Estrada was identified, July 18, 2025, Clark Perry Baldwin suffered a heart attack in a Tennessee hospital. He had been ill for 2 days. At 8:50 in the morning, Tennessee time, he died. The man who had bragged about killing women. The man whose ex-wife had reported him and seen that report disappear into bureaucratic silence. The man whose DNA had been sitting on 3 women's bodies for 30 years, waiting to be matched. The man who had pushed his shopping cart through Walmart and put his garbage out at the curb and trusted that the highway would keep his secrets forever. He was gone. Sweetwater County Attorney Danny Aramusp, who had filed murder charges against Baldwin in 2020 and watched the Tennessee case unfold for 5 years with particular attention, received the news with the particular bitterness of a man who had been 30 years in the pursuit and arrived to find the door already closed. "There's not going to be an extradition," Assistant DA Pam Anderson told reporters. Clark Perry Baldwin died this morning. Aramusp's frustration was palpable and understandable. He had done his work. His case was ready. The evidence was solid. And the man he was going to prosecute had cheated the Wyoming courtroom with the one exit that no jurisdiction can block. Even so, Aramusp found something to hold on to. Speaking of Irene Vasquez, of Bitter Creek Betty, he said the words that mattered most to the people who had been waiting for them. "We know what happened to Irene, and we know who did it. It is not justice in the full sense. It is not a verdict read aloud in a courtroom. It is not a sentence pronounced by a judge with the weight of law behind it. But it is something. It is the end of the question that had haunted her case since March 1st, 1992. It is the closing of the uncertainty that her death had lived inside for more than 3 decades. And for Cindy Estrada, identified just 1 day before her killer died, it is the restoration of a name that Baldwin had effectively stolen when he left her unnamed and unavenged in that Wyoming ditch. Baldwin's defense attorney had filed a motion for a new trial in the Tennessee case, a motion that was still pending at the time of his death. It became, as the assistant district attorney dryly noted, a moot point. Back in Iowa, the cold cases that investigators had hoped Baldwin might answer for remained exactly that, cold. Rhonda Knutson's murder at the truck stop near Williamstown, the bludgeoning death that matched Baldwin's geographic history so precisely, remained unsolved. Tammy Jo Zawicki's family had no new answers. The 24 cases on Jody Ewing's list. Women found in ditches near highways, bearing injuries consistent with the methodology of a long-haul trucker who had developed a pattern of violence over years. Those cases remained officially open, their connection to Baldwin unproven in the evidentiary sense that the law requires. The highway is full of silences that no one has yet learned to read. There is a particular category of serial killer that law enforcement professionals have studied intensively since the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative began formally tracking the phenomenon in the early 2000s. They are the long-haul truckers, men who operate within a professional infrastructure that is, almost uniquely among American industries, structured to make them invisible. They cross state lines constantly and legally. Their work requires them to stop in remote locations at all hours of the night. They have documented business reasons for being anywhere they happen to be. And for the categories of victims that the most predatory among them have tended to target, women working in the sex trade at truck stops, hitchhikers, women stranded on roadsides with broken-down vehicles. The reporting ecosystem has historically been thin, fragmented across multiple jurisdictions, and chronically underfunded. Clark Perry Baldwin understood this ecosystem, whether or not he had ever articulated the understanding to himself in explicit terms. He had been driving those roads since 1979. He knew how they worked. He knew which rest stops were quiet and which were busy. He knew that a body left at a remote Wyoming truck stop would take time to find, that it would be processed by a small rural law enforcement agency with limited resources, that any DNA evidence collected would sit in a database that in the early 1990s was nowhere near sophisticated enough to connect it to crimes committed in other states. He knew, or felt with some predatory instinct, that the highway offered a kind of impunity that nowhere else could match. What he could not have anticipated, because no one in 1991 or 1992 could have fully anticipated it, was the revolution in forensic DNA technology that was coming. And specifically, he could not have foreseen the emergence of commercial genealogy databases, the ones that ordinary people use to find cousins they never knew they had, to trace the migration patterns of great-grandparents, to satisfy the deep human hunger for connection and origin. These databases, uploaded voluntarily by millions of Americans, became in the hands of skilled forensic genealogists something Baldwin had no defense against. A net that could capture him from his own family tree, through the DNA of a relative who had no idea they were being used as a key to unlock a murder case. The technique that ultimately led to Baldwin's identification, the same technique that had previously cracked the Golden State Killer case in California in 2018. Works by comparing a crime scene DNA profile against the profiles uploaded to public genealogy databases and finding partial matches that indicate familial relationship. From there, genealogists build out a family tree around the partial match, working forward through generations and cross-referencing names, ages, and geographic histories until a small circle of suspects emerges. In Baldwin's case, the circle contracted to him specifically after investigators established his history as a truck driver, confirmed that his routes overlapped with the crime scenes, and verified his age range against what the evidence suggested about the killer. And then came the trash. Those garbage bags at the curb, the shopping cart at Walmart, the most ordinary objects in the most ordinary American life, yielding the biological evidence that would end 3 decades of freedom. There is something almost poetic in the mundaneness of it. This man who had hidden behind ordinariness for so long, undone finally by the most ordinary thing of all, his own discarded refuse. The capture of Clark Perry Baldwin raises questions that extend well beyond his individual case. Questions that anyone who studies predatory violence and its relationship to American infrastructure would find deeply uncomfortable. The first and most pressing is simple: how many more? The Iowa Cold Cases website alone produced a list of over 24 potential victims whose circumstances matched Baldwin's profile and methodology. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative, launched specifically to address the particular ecosystem of violence connected to the trucking industry, maintains a database of hundreds of cases involving victims found near highways, the vast majority of them women, the vast majority of them falling into the categories of people who move through American society's margins and whose disappearances receive less institutional attention than they deserve. Baldwin was a truck driver for Martin Transport during his most active period of confirmed violence. His routes took him across an enormous swath of the country, and if the pattern of his known crimes, the targeted vulnerability of his victims, the remote disposal of bodies, the use of his truck as both a weapon and an escape vehicle, held consistent across years of driving, then the 3 confirmed murders may represent only the fraction of his violence that modern forensic science managed to illuminate. The rest, if there is a rest, remains in the dark. This is not speculation designed to sensationalize. It is the sober assessment of the investigators themselves, who said explicitly after Baldwin's arrest that they were being contacted by state agencies across the country with similar cases. Mike Crapful of the Iowa DCI confirmed it publicly. The cases were numerous. The patterns were similar. The connections were being investigated. Baldwin cooperated with none of it. He denied killing Rhonda Knutson until he died. He said nothing about Tammy Zawicki. He gave investigators no roadmap into whatever additional darkness might lie along the highways of his past. The partial confession he had given to the Texas Ranger in 1991, the one in which he admitted forcing sex on Mary and Newton, was the most he ever yielded. A man who had bragged to his ex-wife about killing a woman apparently decided, somewhere between that bragging and his arrest, that silence was the better strategy. He was wrong about the highways keeping his secrets forever. He was, unfortunately, at least partially right about dying before he could be made to give them up. For the women he killed. For Pamela McCall and her daughter Angel, for Irene Vasquez, for Cindy Estrada and the child she was carrying. His death is a particular kind of injustice. Pamela got a verdict. She got a jury that heard her story and said his name in the context of guilty. Irene and Cindy did not get that. Their cases were charged and ready and then made irrelevant by a heart attack in a Tennessee hospital room. Sweetwater County Attorney Danny Aramusp had spent 5 years preparing to bring Baldwin to trial in Wyoming. Sheridan County Attorney Diana Bennett had filed her charges and sealed her case and waited. Neither of them will ever stand before a Wyoming jury and speak the names of Irene Vasquez and Cindy Estrada in a courtroom where Baldwin is sitting at the defendant's table. That is the version of justice that Baldwin escaped. Not all versions. Irene Vasquez is no longer Bitter Creek Betty. She has her name back. Her family knows what happened to her. The man who killed her has been identified, charged, convicted of another of his murders, and is dead. He will never walk freely again. He will never drive another highway. He will never again look at another woman stranded on a roadside and calculate how alone she is. Cindy Estrada is no longer I-90 Jane Doe. Her name was given back to her the day before her killer died. A timeline so precise it reads almost like something scripted, though it was simply the relentless work of investigators refusing to stop. She was 21 years old. She was from Torrance, California. She was 10 weeks pregnant. She deserved to live to see her child born, and the man who ensured that she did not is gone. And Mary and Newton, the woman who survived, spent 34 years carrying the memory of what happened inside that truck in the Texas Panhandle in February 1991. She pointed a gun at the man who had just raped and bound and tried to choke her, and she survived. She testified at his trial in 2025. She helped put him away. And whatever complicated mixture of feelings attends that kind of reckoning after 3.5 decades, she has something that Pamela and Irene and Cindy never got. She got to look at him from across a courtroom while the word guilty hung in the air. The American highway is still full of trucks. It is still full of rest stops that are quiet in the small hours of the morning, of stretches of interstate that run for miles without an exit, of the particular vulnerability that comes from being stranded at the roadside with nowhere to go and no one you know within driving distance. The ecosystem that Clark Perry Baldwin exploited still exists. The FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative continues to track cases that fit the profile. Investigators across multiple states continue to look at old evidence with new technology. And in the databases, the ones that millions of ordinary Americans populated with their own genetic histories in the hope of finding something about themselves, there are profiles waiting. There are partial matches sitting unexamined. There are family trees that, when someone finally builds them out to the right branch, will collapse into a name that law enforcement has been looking for. The highway does not keep secrets forever. It never has, not really. It only delays. It only makes the living wait a little longer for what the dead already know. Clark Perry Baldwin, the man who drove millions of miles across the American landscape, who kept his violence hidden behind a reputation for gentleness, who bragged about killing women and then trusted the road to bury the evidence, lived 63 years and died in a Tennessee hospital 2 days after a heart attack. He died convicted of murder, charged with 2 more, and suspected in a number that no courtroom will ever formally count. He is gone. The women he killed are still here, in evidence files, in DNA databases, in the memories of people who loved them, and now, finally, at least some of them, in the public record with their names intact. Pamela McCall, Irene Vasquez, Cindy Estrada, Angel, who never had a birthday. The unnamed others, if they exist, who are still waiting for the technology and the time and the investigator who refuses to stop. The road is long. The dead are patient. And somewhere in a genealogy database, a partial match is waiting to become a name. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Man with the Perfect Lawn, the Herb Baumeister case. There is something quietly unsettling about a man who seems to have everything. Not in the way that makes you suspicious at first glance. No, not that kind of unsettling. It's the other kind. The kind that only becomes clear in hindsight when you go back through the photographs and the newspaper clippings and the neighbors' old interviews, and you realize that every single person who knew him used almost the exact same words. Words like pleasant. Words like normal. Words like he was just a regular guy who loved his family. And you sit with that for a moment. Really sit with it. Because the truth is that those words are almost never used to describe the men we actually remember as regular. Regular men don't make the news. Regular men don't leave behind bone fragments in their own backyards. Regular men don't vanish one summer afternoon, cross an international border, and die alone in a Canadian provincial park with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, while their families are still trying to understand what has happened to their lives. Herb Baumeister was a husband. He was a father of 3. He was a businessman in the American Midwest who wore polo shirts and drove through quiet suburbs and smiled at his neighbors on Saturday mornings. He built a company with his wife from almost nothing, and for a while that company thrived. He had a home. Not just a house, but a genuine, sprawling estate called Fox Hollow Farm, 17 acres of land in Hamilton County, Indiana, with a pool, a pond, a long gravel driveway, and trees so dense they swallowed the sound of everything beyond the fence line. And in the soil beneath those trees, investigators would eventually find the skeletal remains of at least 11 human beings. This is not a story that begins with a scream. It doesn't open in a dark alley or with a body found at dawn. It begins, instead, in the most ordinary place imaginable, in the middle of a life that looked, from every angle anyone bothered to look, completely fine. That is what makes it so difficult to absorb. Not the violence itself, but the silence around it. The years that passed without a single alarm. The world that continued moving while something profoundly wrong was happening just past the tree line of a quiet Indiana estate. This is the story of Herb Baumeister. And it is told not to shock you, but because the truth deserves to be spoken plainly, carefully, and completely. To understand what happened at Fox Hollow Farm, you have to understand the world it existed inside. And more than that, you have to understand the man who built it. Herbert Richard Baumeister was born on April 7, 1947, in Indianapolis, Indiana. From a relatively early age, those around him noticed certain behaviors that fell outside what most people would consider typical. As a child, he reportedly once urinated on his teacher's desk. He was known to play with dead animals. These are details that, in isolation, might be dismissed as childhood eccentricity, troubling, yes, but not necessarily predictive. Plenty of children do strange things. Most of them grow up to live unremarkable lives. But context matters, and in retrospect, those early signs were part of a longer and more complicated picture. Baumeister attended Indiana University, where he studied and eventually left without completing his degree. He worked in various capacities over the years, including a stint in journalism. He was, by many accounts, intelligent, capable of charm, and possessed of a strong desire for social legitimacy, for the kind of visible, respectable life that announces itself through property and profession. In 1971, he married Julie Sater. By most accounts, the early years of their marriage were relatively stable, though Herb's behavior could be unpredictable and erratic. He had periods of what might be described today as emotional volatility, moments where his mood shifted abruptly and without obvious cause. But Julie, who was deeply invested in the life they were building together, understood him in a way that others perhaps didn't. She loved him, she believed in him, and for a long time that belief held the shape of their life together intact. The couple had 3 children, Marie, Mark, and Eric. They were, in all the ways that mattered externally, a family. They went to school events. They attended church. They maintained the kind of social presence that reads, to the outside world, as wholesome and uncomplicated. The most significant development in the Baumeister household, from a practical standpoint, came in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when Herb and Julie founded a thrift store chain called Save-A-Lot. The business grew steadily, eventually expanding to multiple locations across Indiana. It was legitimate, community-oriented work, the kind of enterprise that earns goodwill simply by existing, that makes people feel warmly toward its owners without requiring much scrutiny. The stores did well. The income allowed the family to purchase Fox Hollow Farm in 1991, a property in Westfield, Hamilton County, that was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. 17 acres, a large main house, a swimming pool in the backyard, pond, outbuildings, dense, mature trees along the perimeter that created a sense of enclosure, of privacy that felt comfortable rather than suspicious, the way privacy always does when it belongs to people we trust. The Baumeisters settled in. Their neighbors found them pleasant. Their business continued to operate. And Herb, who had always been drawn to a particular social world that he kept carefully separated from his domestic life, continued to move through that world as well. Indianapolis in the early 1990s had a gay social scene that, like most Midwestern cities of the era, existed partly in the open and partly in shadow. There were bars and clubs, places where gay men gathered, where community formed in the specific way it forms when the broader world offers only conditional acceptance. The early years of that decade were still profoundly shaped by the AIDS crisis, which had devastated the gay community throughout the 1980s and continued to cast a long shadow. Men went missing, men died, and in an era when gay men were so often invisible to mainstream institutions, when their lives were undervalued and their disappearances frequently uninvestigated with the seriousness they deserved, the absence of a person could go unremarked upon for a very long time. This is a fact that matters enormously to what followed. Beginning in the early 1990s, men began disappearing from the gay bar scene in Indianapolis. They were young men, mostly, men in their 20s and 30s, men who had friends and families and lives, men whose absence was noticed by the people who loved them, even if it was not always noticed by the systems designed to protect citizens from harm. Their names were Roger Goodlett, Richard Hamilton, Stephen Hale, Manuel Resendez, Johnny Bayer, Alan Broussard, David Rosenberry, Michael Kieran, Curtis Peterson, and others still being identified even now, decades later. Each of them, at some point, crossed paths with a man named Herb Baumeister. At the time, none of that was known. What was known, in the bars and among the community, was simply that men were disappearing. People noticed, people worried, people talked, but the connections remained invisible, hidden beneath the surface of a life that looked, from the outside, completely fine. Meanwhile, at Fox Hollow Farm, Herb continued to be a husband and father. He continued to run the business. He continued to cut the grass and maintain the property and exist, visibly and normally, in the middle of the life he had built. The lawn, by all accounts, was immaculate. There is a particular kind of horror that lives not in what is visible, but in what is deliberately concealed. Not the dramatic concealment of fiction, not underground rooms or elaborate mechanisms, but the quiet, daily concealment of simply continuing as normal. Of waking up and making coffee and going to work and coming home, while underneath the surface of everything, something monstrous is being sustained. That is the horror that belongs to this story, and it had barely begun. Patterns, by their nature, only become visible once someone decides to look for them. Until then, they exist as isolated events, scattered, unconnected dots that no one has yet drawn a line between. For several years in the early 1990s, the disappearances of gay men in Indianapolis existed exactly that way. Each case was its own tragedy. Each family grieved in relative isolation. And while concern circulated within the community itself, the institutional response was, at best, fragmented. Part of this was the era. Law enforcement in the United States in the early 1990s was not uniformly equipped, practically or culturally, to take the disappearances of gay men with the same gravity it afforded other missing persons cases. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is an accurate one. Bias existed, assumptions were made, and the result was that a series of cases that might, under different circumstances, have been connected and investigated as a pattern were instead treated as separate individual matters. Into this gap walked a private investigator named Mary Wilson. Wilson had been hired by the family of one of the missing men, Roger Goodlett, who had last been seen in 1993. As Wilson began pulling on threads, interviewing people who had known Goodlett, retracing his last known movements, a name kept surfacing. Not dramatically, not with any obvious urgency, just quietly, persistently. A man who frequented the same bars, who had been seen with several of the missing men, who went by the name Brian Smart. The name was false, but it pointed eventually toward a real person. That real person was Herb Baumeister. Wilson brought what she had found to law enforcement. She approached the Indianapolis Police Department and shared her concerns, that the disappearances might be connected, that a single individual might be responsible, and that that individual had been identified. It was not a small thing to allege. It was, in fact, an extraordinary claim, the kind that requires substantiation before action can be taken. And at first, the information did not move quickly through the channels it needed to move through. There were reasons for this. Baumeister was a married man, a businessman, a homeowner. He fit no obvious profile. His public life offered no immediate red flags, nothing that a quick glance would identify as alarming. And without physical evidence, without a confession, without something concrete to anchor the suspicion, the investigation stalled. But Mary Wilson did not stop. She continued gathering. She continued pressing. And in the meantime, Herb Baumeister's personal life was beginning to fracture in ways that had nothing, on the surface, to do with any of this. His marriage to Julie had grown strained. The business, which had been their shared achievement, was beginning to struggle financially. The Save-A-Lot stores were facing difficulties that compounded over time, and with them, the economic foundation of the family's life at Fox Hollow Farm grew less stable. Herb's behavior at home had become more erratic, more volatile, more unpredictable. Julie was navigating the slow collapse of something she had spent her adult life building, and she was doing it largely alone. It was during this period, around 1994, that one of the Baumeister children, a young boy, made an offhand comment to his mother. He mentioned, in the casual way that children mention things they don't fully understand, that he had found a skull on the property. A human skull partially buried near the pool area. Children sometimes confuse what they see. Julie, not wanting to believe what the alternative might mean, attributed it to some kind of animal remains. She did not investigate further. She could not bring herself to. This moment, quiet, domestic, almost mundane in its delivery, would later be understood as one of the most significant missed opportunities in the entire case. But it is worth sitting with it rather than judging it. Julie Baumeister was not a woman who had any reason, yet, to believe the man she had married was capable of what he was actually doing. The human mind protects itself. It reaches for the explanation that allows life to continue. And in that moment, in that house, continuation was all she had. The year 1995 brought a shift. Law enforcement, responding to the continued pressure from Wilson's investigation and the accumulating weight of the missing persons cases, sought permission to search Fox Hollow Farm. They approached Herb Baumeister. He refused them access. This was legally his right. A man's home is not subject to search simply because someone has made allegations. But the refusal was noted. It added texture to the concern that was building around him. Julie, who was by this point aware that investigators had questions about Herb, questions she did not yet fully understand, was placed in an impossibly difficult position. She had children. She had a life. She had a husband she was no longer sure she knew. And the story she had been living inside was beginning, slowly and terribly, to reveal itself as something other than the story she had believed it to be. In 1996, Herb and Julie separated. She and the children moved out of Fox Hollow Farm. And in that departure, in the simple act of a family leaving a house, a door opened that had been closed for years, because now the property could be searched. In July of 1996, investigators arrived at Fox Hollow Farm with permission to examine the grounds. What they found there, buried in the soil, scattered across the earth, would confirm in the most concrete and devastating terms possible that everything Mary Wilson had suspected was true. Bone fragments, skeletal remains, evidence of multiple individuals, spread across the acreage of a quiet Indiana estate where a family had lived, and a lawn had been mowed, and neighbors had waved from the road without suspicion. The scope of what had happened at Fox Hollow Farm was, even for experienced investigators, profoundly difficult to absorb. And Herb Baumeister was already gone. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a discovery of this magnitude. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of too much, arriving all at once. When the remains were found at Fox Hollow Farm in the summer of 1996, the investigation that had quietly circulated for years suddenly became something else entirely. It became urgent. It became public. And it became a case that investigators were now racing to complete, because the man at its center had already slipped beyond their reach. Herb Baumeister had left the United States. Following the separation from Julie and the increasing pressure of the inquiries surrounding him, he had driven north, crossing into Canada. On July 3, 1996, his body was found in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 49 years old. He left a suicide note. It did not address the disappearances or the deaths. It spoke, instead, of his failing business and the dissolution of his marriage, the mundane architecture of a life falling apart. Whether this was deliberate obfuscation, compartmentalization, or some genuine inability to confront what he had done, is a question that cannot be answered now. He took whatever answer existed with him. The timing of his death, just days before the excavation of Fox Hollow Farm would begin in earnest, meant that the investigation unfolded without its primary subject. There was no arrest, no interrogation, no courtroom, no moment where Herb Baumeister sat across from a prosecutor and was made to answer for anything. This absence becomes, in retrospect, one of the most significant features of the entire case, because it left so many things permanently unresolved. The forensic work at Fox Hollow Farm continued through the summer and into the fall of 1996. Investigators worked carefully and methodically across the 17 acres, recovering remains that would eventually be connected to at least 11 individuals. The process was painstaking. Skeletal remains in outdoor environments degrade over time, and the task of identifying individuals from fragmentary evidence is both technically demanding and emotionally taxing for everyone involved. The remains that were recovered were sent for analysis. Identifications were made one by one as DNA evidence and forensic techniques allowed. Some of the men recovered from Fox Hollow Farm had been missing for years by the time their families received confirmation. For those families, the news was not a surprise exactly. When a person has been missing for a long time, there is a grief that exists in anticipation of the worst. But confirmation carries its own particular weight, closes one door and opens another. It transforms hope, however faded, into something more final. Among those identified were men whose names had circulated in the missing persons investigations for years. Roger Goodlett, Richard Hamilton, Stephen Hale. Men who had families and histories and lives that continued to matter, even now, even after everything. Families who had spent years not knowing and who now knew, which is better than not knowing but is not, in any complete sense, relief. Julie Baumeister's experience during this period is one of the most humanly complicated threads in the entire story. She had not known. This was established through the investigation. There was no evidence to suggest that Julie had any awareness of what her husband had been doing, or that she had participated in or enabled any of it. But knowing and not knowing are not simple binary states. Julie had lived in that house. Her children had played in that yard. She had made a life with a man who had used the property they shared as the site of something she could never have fully imagined. She has spoken publicly about the experience in limited ways over the years, and what emerges from those accounts is not a portrait of denial but of genuine disorientation, the specific vertigo that comes from discovering that the story you lived inside was not the story that was actually happening. She had been deceived, completely, methodically, for years, and the discovery of that deception did not come with clean edges or simple closure. It came wrapped in grief and confusion and the terrible task of protecting her children from a truth that would shape the rest of their lives. The investigators who worked the case have spoken, in various interviews and accounts, about what it was like to work through those months. The excavation, the identifications, the reconstruction of a timeline from evidence that Baumeister had never intended to be found. Lieutenant Ken Weisenhunt of the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department was among those centrally involved. The case was, by any professional standard, one of the most significant serial investigations in Indiana history, and it was being conducted in the peculiar absence of a suspect who could be questioned or charged. There was also the question of scope. Investigators believed, based on what was recovered at Fox Hollow Farm and on patterns in the missing persons cases, that Baumeister was likely responsible for more deaths than could be confirmed. Some estimates suggested the number of victims could be significantly higher than 11, possibly as many as 16 or more, extending to victims in Ohio and other nearby states. The full breadth of what he did may never be known. This uncertainty, this open edge at the end of the case, is one of the things that makes it so enduringly difficult to set down. Closure, in the traditional sense, was never achieved. The families of the confirmed victims had the grim relief of identification. But the investigation could not pursue charges, could not test evidence in court, could not, in the formal and public way that the justice system provides, account for what happened. It simply stopped. Not with a verdict, but with a body in a Canadian park and a property full of what had been hidden for years. The quiet of Fox Hollow Farm, after the investigators left, must have been extraordinary. Pinery Provincial Park is a quiet place. It sits along the eastern shore of Lake Huron in southern Ontario, a stretch of natural landscape known for its sand dunes, its forests, its trails that wind through terrain that feels genuinely remote despite being only a few hours from several major cities. People go there to hike, to camp, to be still for a while. It is not a famous place. It does not carry any particular weight in the public imagination, except that it is where Herb Baumeister died. And in that, it carries everything. There was no trial. There was no formal charging document that laid out, in the precise legal language that cases require, the full accounting of what Herb Baumeister did and to whom. The criminal justice system, which is designed to handle exactly these situations, to prosecute, to adjudicate, to sentence, was never given the opportunity to function. Baumeister's death foreclosed that process entirely. What remained, instead, was the work of documentation, of identification, of memory. In the years following the discovery at Fox Hollow Farm, the property changed hands. The house was sold. New owners came and went. At one point, the estate became the subject of paranormal interest. Ghost hunting television programs visited the property, and it developed a reputation in those particular cultural circles that is entirely separate from, and in some ways obscures, the factual reality of what occurred there. Fox Hollow Farm became, for some people, primarily a haunted house. For the families of the men whose remains were found there, it remained something else entirely, the place where their fathers, brothers, sons, and friends had been discarded. The distinction matters. One of the lasting societal dimensions of the Baumeister case is the question of institutional failure. Specifically, the failure of law enforcement to respond adequately to the disappearances of gay men in Indianapolis during the years when Baumeister was active. This is not a peripheral detail. It is central to understanding how the case was able to continue for as long as it did. Had the early missing persons reports been treated with greater urgency, had the pattern been identified sooner, had the specific vulnerabilities of the community been taken more seriously by the systems meant to protect it, some of what happened might have been prevented. This is not a claim made lightly. Prevention is always easier to argue in retrospect. But the record is clear. Warnings were raised within the community before they were acted upon institutionally. Mary Wilson, the private investigator, identified a suspect and brought that information forward before the official investigation reached the same conclusions. The gap between those two timelines, between community knowledge and institutional response, represents a real and documentable failure, one that the case has come to illustrate in ways that remain relevant to how law enforcement approaches vulnerable communities today. In the decades since 1996, there have been meaningful reforms in how missing persons cases involving LGBTQ+ individuals are handled in many jurisdictions. The awareness that bias can shape investigative priorities, and that this bias has real, sometimes fatal consequences, has become more widely acknowledged within law enforcement training and practice. The Baumeister case is cited in academic and criminological literature as a clear example of the way in which social marginalization can function as a kind of protection for perpetrators, shielding them from scrutiny precisely because their victims are less likely to receive institutional attention. That is a difficult sentence to read. It is worth reading slowly. For the families of the victims, the aftermath of the case has been a long, quiet, and largely private experience. Some have spoken publicly, some have not. The nature of grief over a long period of unresolved loss is different from acute grief. It spreads out, becomes part of the texture of daily life rather than a sudden sharp event. Several families spent years not knowing what had happened to the men they loved. The confirmation that came from the Fox Hollow Farm excavation was, as one family member described it, both devastating and necessary. Devastating because it removed the last possibility of a different outcome. Necessary because without it, the not knowing continues indefinitely. There remains, even now, the question of victims who were never identified. The remains recovered from Fox Hollow Farm were extensive, but not all fragments yielded identifiable information. Forensic science has continued to advance in the years since 1996, and there have been ongoing efforts, both by law enforcement and by advocacy organizations, to pursue identifications using updated DNA techniques. Some of those efforts are still active. The possibility remains that names not yet spoken will eventually be confirmed, that families not yet notified will eventually receive answers. That ongoing work is important. Not because it changes the facts of what happened, but because it honors the basic human principle that people deserve to be known, that their existence deserves to be documented and acknowledged, regardless of how they were treated in death. There is also the question of Herb Baumeister himself, not as a figure to be understood sympathetically, but as a subject of genuine psychological inquiry. What produces a person capable of what he did? This is not a question asked in order to excuse or mitigate. It is asked because understanding, real, rigorously examined understanding, is the only tool available for prevention. The literature on individuals who lead what criminologists call a double life is extensive, and Baumeister represents a particularly acute version of that phenomenon. A man who maintained a fully functional domestic and professional existence while simultaneously engaging in behavior that was, by any measure, catastrophic. What his wife and children experienced in the years following the discovery is a dimension of the case that is rarely discussed with adequate care. They, too, were victims, not in the same way as the men who lost their lives, but in a genuine and lasting sense. They lost their home. They lost the version of their father and husband that they had believed existed. They were required to reconstruct their understanding of their own past, knowing that the man they had trusted most had been living a life entirely invisible to them. Marie, Mark, and Eric Baumeister were children when this happened. They are adults now, and the weight of that origin story is something they carry into every room they enter. Julie Baumeister, who cooperated with investigators and who has maintained, over the years, a dignified and largely private existence, deserves particular recognition for the clarity she brought to a situation of almost incomprehensible complexity. She helped. In a moment when she had every reason to retreat entirely, she helped. Fox Hollow Farm still stands. The property has changed. The address is known, the history is documented, and the land has moved through time the way all land does, absorbing what happened to it without being able to speak. The pool is still there, or was. The trees still stand. The driveway is still long and quiet in the way that long driveways are. And somewhere in Hamilton County, Indiana, the names of at least 11 men are attached to an account of what happened to them. An account that is incomplete, imperfect, and will never be finished in the way that proper endings are meant to finish things. Because Herb Baumeister died before he could be made to answer. Because the justice system never got its turn. Because some questions, when the person who holds the answers is gone, simply remain questions. That is the most unsettling thing about this story, when you sit with it long enough. Not the crime itself, not even the scale of it, but the silence that closed around it. The way it ended not with a reckoning, but with a drive north, a park, and a note that talked about business troubles. The men who were lost deserve better than that ending. They deserve, at minimum, to be remembered by name, in full, without euphemism. They were Roger Goodlett, Richard Hamilton, Stephen Hale, Manuel Resendez, Johnny Bayer, Alan Broussard, David Rosenberry, Michael Kieran, Curtis Peterson, and others still being named. They were people. They mattered before anyone knew what had happened to them, and they matter still. That is the only appropriate place to end. Not with the perpetrator, not with the estate or the investigation or the long procedural aftermath. With the people who were taken, with their names, with the fact that they were here. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Toolbox Killers. There is a type of evil that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with warning signs posted on the door, or with a face that the neighbors immediately distrust, or with a history so obviously broken that someone, somewhere, should have seen it coming from miles away. Sometimes evil arrives quietly, in the passenger seat of a silver van, moving slowly down a sun-warmed street in Southern California, on an ordinary afternoon in the late 1970s, when the world still felt wide open and full of possibility. It arrives with a smile, with a camera, with a carefully rehearsed line about taking pictures for a modeling portfolio. It arrives looking, to the untrained eye, entirely unremarkable. And that is perhaps the most unsettling truth at the center of this story. Not the darkness itself, but how well it was hidden. How long it moved through ordinary spaces, grocery stores, parking lots, suburban neighborhoods, the kind of places where families lived and teenagers walked home from school, without anyone knowing what it was carrying. Lawrence Bittaker was 52 years old when he was sentenced to death in 1981. By then, the case that bore his name alongside that of his accomplice, Roy Norris, had already disturbed investigators who prided themselves on having seen everything. A senior FBI profiler who reviewed the evidence later described it as among the most disturbing material he had ever encountered in a long career. Not because of its scale, there have been killers with longer victim lists, but because of its deliberateness, because of the documentation, because of what it revealed about the human capacity to plan, to collaborate, and to feel nothing. This is the story of how two men met inside a California prison, discovered a shared ideology that most people would not dare to name, and then, upon their release, spent months methodically carrying it out. It is a story about the failures of a system that released both men despite clear signals. It is about 5 young women between the ages of 13 and 18 who deserved full lives and did not receive them. And it is about the quiet, ordinary-looking roads of Los Angeles County, which kept their secrets for a while, but not forever. This is not a story that will rush you. It will take its time, the way the truth so often has to. California in the 1970s carried a particular kind of mythology about itself. It was warm in ways that went beyond climate. Warm with possibility, with cultural reinvention, with the lingering afterglow of a decade that had promised liberation and, in many corners, still believed it had delivered. The beaches were full. The freeways were expanding. Los Angeles County stretched outward in all directions like something that could not quite contain its own ambition. And in the suburban communities that lined its edges, Torrance, Redondo Beach, Hawthorne, Inglewood, ordinary life moved at the pace of lawn sprinklers and weekend barbecues and teenagers drifting through summer afternoons with nowhere particular to be. It was into this world that Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born on September 27, 1940, though the precise circumstances of his early life are difficult to trace with certainty, in part because he was adopted and in part because he demonstrated from a relatively young age an unusual relationship with honesty. What is documented is that his adolescence was marked by a series of escalating run-ins with the law. He was a drifter in the truest sense, not just geographically, though he moved often, but morally, in the sense that he seemed to pass through ethical frameworks without ever being touched by them. His criminal record began in earnest in his teenage years, and by the time he was in his late 20s, it included auto theft, hit and run, and various acts of fraud and deception. He had a high IQ, this is documented, and several accounts suggest he was aware of this and used it not as a foundation for any kind of productive life but as a tool for maneuvering. He was charming when charm was useful. He was cold when coldness was more efficient. He seemed to understand people primarily as variables in equations that he was constantly running. In 1978, Bittaker was serving time at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. It was there that he encountered Roy Lewis Norris. Norris had his own history, one that was arguably more overtly alarming than Bittaker's in terms of its content, but had still not been enough to keep him permanently incarcerated. Born in 1948, Norris had a documented history of sexual assault. He had been convicted of rape in the early 1970s and committed to the Atascadero State Hospital as a mentally disordered sex offender. After his release, he reoffended. He was convicted again and sent to the California Men's Colony, where, in the ordinary course of prison life, in a yard over meals, through the slow geography of shared incarceration, he and Bittaker found each other. What they shared is worth sitting with for a moment because it was not simply a shared appetite for violence, though that was certainly present. What they appeared to share was something more structured than that. A mutual recognition, a kind of philosophical alignment around the idea that they were owed something by the world, and that the rules governing other people's behavior did not necessarily apply to them. Investigators and psychologists who later reviewed the case would describe their dynamic as mutually reinforcing in a way that made each man more dangerous than he would have been alone. Bittaker brought planning, patience, and a forensic attention to detail. Norris brought physical capacity and a history that had already crossed lines Bittaker, at that point, had not. They made a plan. This is the part that requires stillness to absorb properly. Inside the California men's colony, two convicted criminals sat together and made a plan, a specific, goal-oriented, organized plan, to abduct, assault, and kill young women upon their release. They discussed it. They refined it. They arrived at details. One account, drawn from Norris's later cooperation with prosecutors, suggests they even discussed the idea of collecting one victim from each teenage year, spanning the ages of 13 through 19, as a kind of organizing framework. This was not impulsive. It was not born of a spontaneous moment of rage or opportunity. It was premeditated in the most complete sense of the word, conceived, discussed, and agreed upon before either man had taken a single step outside the prison gates. Norris was paroled in 1978. Bittaker followed in November of that same year. By the following spring, they had acquired a van, a silver GMC cargo van that Bittaker named, with a coldness that is difficult to fully process, Murder Mac. They had also acquired a camera, a tape recorder, and a specific operational philosophy. They would use the van to cruise the coastal areas of Los Angeles County, approach young women, offer them rides or flattery, and take them somewhere isolated. The world they moved through was not unaware that predators existed. Parents warned their daughters. Schools had programs. But the warnings of that era were calibrated to a certain image of danger, the obvious stranger, the visibly threatening figure. Bittaker and Norris did not match that image. They were two men in a van, yes, but they were capable of appearing unthreatening, of adjusting their approach, of reading a situation and calibrating their behavior accordingly. They understood, in a way that made them operationally effective, that most people's defenses are built around what threat looks like, not what it actually is. The geography they chose was not random. The South Bay area of Los Angeles, the communities clustered near the Pacific coast south of the city, offered them a particular combination of features. It was populated, which meant there were potential victims. It was also full of the kinds of transitional spaces. Parking lots, beaches, the long flat stretches of road connecting one suburb to another, where a young person might accept a ride without a second thought. The mountains and canyons nearby offered seclusion. They had, in effect, conducted a kind of operational site assessment, even if they would never have used that language. The year 1979 began quietly in the South Bay. The neighborhoods were going about their lives. School was in session in the spring. Teenagers were moving through the world with the ordinary confidence of youth. The confidence that says something as terrible as what Bittaker and Norris had planned exists only in news stories, only in other places, only to other people. 5 young women would learn otherwise before summer ended. Their names were Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, 16, Andrea Joy Hall, 18, Jacqueline Doris Gilliam, 15, Leah Wilcoxon, 13, and Shirley Lynette Ledford, 16. Each of them was a full person, with families, with futures being imagined, with the kind of ordinary daily life that teenagers live, and that tends to go unrecorded precisely because it is so alive and ongoing. They are not reducible to what happened to them, but what happened to them demands to be understood. The spring of 1979 was mild along the California coast. The van was in circulation, and the system that had produced, housed, and then released 2 men with an explicit plan to kill had no mechanism, not yet, and perhaps not even now in any fully adequate form, for understanding what it had set back into motion. The first disappearance drew relatively little public attention, and this is worth pausing on, not as criticism but as context. Lucinda Lynn Schaefer was 16 years old and living in Torrance, California, when she vanished on June 24, 1979. She was last seen leaving a church meeting with a friend, a detail that later investigators would note as particularly significant, because it suggested a level of calculated approach on the part of the perpetrators that went beyond simply waiting for a vulnerable target. Lucinda was not someone who appeared obviously at risk. She was not in a particularly isolated situation. She was moving through the ordinary rhythms of a Sunday evening in a suburban neighborhood. When she did not come home, her family reported her missing. The report was taken. An investigation, such as it was, began. But missing persons cases in the late 1970s occupied a complicated position in American law enforcement consciousness. There was, at that time, no national database for missing persons. There was no centralized system for connecting disappearances across jurisdictions. Each case tended to be handled locally, processed through local assumptions. Assumptions that often included, however unconsciously, the possibility that a teenager who had gone missing had done so voluntarily. Runaways were a category of explanation that was applied frequently, sometimes correctly and sometimes not, and it had the effect of slowing the urgency of certain investigations in ways that, in retrospect, matter enormously. Bittaker and Norris did not pause. On July 8, 1979, 2 weeks after Lucinda Schaefer disappeared, Andrea Joy Hall was approached near a freeway on-ramp in Redondo Beach. She was 18 years old and had recently turned that age, which placed her technically at the edge of legal adulthood but in no sense prepared her for what was being planned for her. She accepted a ride. The specifics of what happened immediately afterward belong to a category of documented horror that this account will treat with the restraint it deserves. Not because the facts are unimportant, but because the mechanism of violence is less important to understanding this case than the architecture of intent behind it. What matters, in terms of understanding the pattern, is that both Schaefer and Hall disappeared within a short window of time, from similar geographic areas, under circumstances that shared structural similarities. Both were young women approached on or near public roads. Both were alone. Both apparently had no reason to identify the men who approached them as presenting immediate danger. And both disappeared without witnesses, without evidence left in easily discoverable locations, without the kind of immediate forensic trail that might have connected the two cases quickly. This is the operational logic that Bittaker, in particular, had thought through during his time in prison. He understood something that investigators would later articulate in their analyses: that a crime which leaves no immediate physical anchor point is extraordinarily difficult to investigate in real time. You cannot follow a trail that has not been laid in visible places. You can only wait, which is precisely what law enforcement, still unaware that a pattern was even forming, was doing. The summer of 1979 moved forward. The South Bay went on about its life. On September 2, 1979, Jacqueline Doris Gilliam and Leah Wilcoxon were walking along a bike trail near Rolling Hills when they were approached by the two men in the silver van. Jacqueline was 15. Leah was 13 years old, the youngest of the 5 victims, and the age that, according to the plan Norris would later describe to prosecutors, was deliberately targeted as part of their organized framework. The two girls were together, which represented a departure from the pattern of approaching single individuals, and it speaks to the escalating confidence, or perhaps the deteriorating operational caution, that appeared to be developing between the two men as the summer progressed. Both girls disappeared that afternoon. The disappearance of two young women simultaneously, from the same location, changed the calculus slightly. It was harder to attribute two concurrent disappearances to voluntary flight. The Torrance and Los Angeles County Sheriff's Departments began paying slightly more attention, but the machinery of connection between these disappearances and the earlier ones was still not in place. These were different jurisdictions, different reporting officers, different families, all of them living through the particular anguish of not knowing. What the investigators did not know, what could not have been fully visible from where they stood, was that Bittaker and Norris had also begun recording. Not simply photographing, which they had been doing with some of the earlier interactions, but audio recording. Bittaker possessed a tape recorder that he used during the abductions, a detail that would not become fully known until after the arrest, but that speaks with particular clarity to the psychological makeup of the man. He was not simply acting. He was documenting. He was producing a record for his own purposes of what he and Norris were doing. This is a behavior pattern that forensic psychologists associate with a desire for possession beyond the moment, a need to own and replay an experience that goes beyond the act itself and into something that functions almost like archive keeping. The tape recordings became, ultimately, a critical piece of the evidentiary puzzle that undid them. But in the summer and early fall of 1979, they were simply one more element of a plan that was, from the perpetrator's perspective, proceeding without serious interference. October brought the fifth and final victim. Shirley Lynette Ledford was 16 years old and trying to hitchhike home from a Halloween party in the San Fernando Valley on the night of October 31, 1979. The symbolism of the date has occasionally been noted in coverage of the case, though symbolism is perhaps the wrong frame. What the date actually represents is simply the availability of a young woman in a transitional space on an evening when such availability was slightly higher than usual, because it was a holiday and people were moving around and a girl trying to get home might accept a ride without extended deliberation. She accepted the ride. What followed, on a stretch of road in the San Fernando Valley, lasted for an extended period. The tape recorder was running. Bittaker and Norris did not hurry. This was not impulsive violence. It was conducted with the same cold deliberateness that had characterized everything that preceded it. Unlike the earlier victims, whose bodies were taken to the San Gabriel Mountains and disposed of in locations that remained undiscovered for some time, Shirley Ledford's body was left in a residential front yard in Hermosa Beach. This is the detail that most immediately changed the trajectory of the investigation. Not because it led directly to the perpetrators, but because it made visible, in a public and geographically grounded way, that something was happening in the South Bay that could no longer be categorized as ambiguous. A neighbor discovered her body early in the morning of November 1, 1979. Law enforcement responded. The physical evidence at the scene, combined with what medical examiners were able to determine, made it immediately clear that this was not a spontaneous act of violence. The level of planning it implied set investigative instincts into motion that had been, perhaps, insufficiently activated before. The South Bay was no longer simply a place where young women had gone missing. It was now a place where a body had appeared. And bodies, unlike missing persons, have a way of demanding to be understood. The investigation that followed, and the chain of connections it eventually made, is a story about both the capabilities and the limits of law enforcement in an era before many of the tools we now take for granted. It is also a story about the particular role that an ordinary social encounter, not a police operation, not a forensic breakthrough, but a conversation between a man and his parole officer, would ultimately play in bringing the architecture of murder that Bittaker and Norris had constructed finally to the ground. The arrest of Roy Norris in November of 1979 did not begin with a murder investigation. It began with a rape. Norris, operating separately from Bittaker in the weeks following the death of Shirley Ledford, had sexually assaulted a woman in the South Bay area. The victim reported the assault. The investigation moved forward with a relative swiftness that contrasts uncomfortably with how long the disappearances of 5 young women had proceeded without similar momentum, though the reasons for that disparity belong to a much longer conversation about how different categories of crime are resourced and prioritized. What matters here is that Norris's DNA and physical description led investigators to him, and in early November 1979, he was arrested. At the time of his arrest, the primary charge was the rape. The connection to the earlier disappearances and to Shirley Ledford's murder had not yet been established. Norris was in custody, but the full scope of what he and Bittaker had done was not yet visible to the investigators who were processing his arrest. Norris was not good at silence. This is, depending on how you view it, either a character failing or the mechanism by which some measure of accountability eventually arrived. During the investigative process that followed his arrest, he began to talk. Not immediately and not fully and not without calculation of his own, but he talked. He mentioned Lawrence Bittaker. He mentioned the van. He mentioned, in terms vague enough to be deniable but specific enough to create enormous investigative interest, the possibility that there were other crimes. Investigators contacted the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Information was cross-referenced. The name Lawrence Bittaker entered the investigation. Bittaker was arrested on December 4, 1979. He was at the time living in Burbank, and accounts of his arrest describe him as calm, a quality that would become a consistent feature of his behavior throughout the legal proceedings that followed. He did not, at the moment of arrest, appear to understand that the architecture he had spent years building was about to be fully exposed. Or perhaps he understood perfectly and had simply reached a state where the external expression of concern no longer seemed useful to him. The search of the silver van yielded evidence. The search of Bittaker's belongings and associated storage yielded more. Among what investigators recovered were photographs, a large number of photographs taken of young women, documenting encounters that ranged in their visible content from seemingly voluntary to clearly not. And among the evidence was the tape recording, the audio documentation of what had been done to Shirley Ledford. The tape became, within law enforcement circles, something of a grim landmark. FBI profilers and investigators who listened to it as part of the case review described reactions ranging from profound disturbance to a kind of traumatic after-effect that stayed with them long after the professional necessity of engaging with the material had passed. It is not, and has never been, publicly released, a decision that reflects both legal prudence and a basic respect for the victim and her family. But its existence and the specificity of what it contained meant that the evidentiary case against both men was, in purely prosecutorial terms, unusually strong. The legal process that followed required the system to make sense of something it was not entirely equipped, philosophically or procedurally, to absorb. Roy Norris made the decision to cooperate with prosecutors. This was a calculated choice. He was facing multiple charges that carried the potential for a death sentence, and cooperation offered a path toward life imprisonment instead. He agreed to plead guilty to 5 counts of murder and 1 count of rape, and to testify against Bittaker in exchange for the prosecution agreeing not to seek the death penalty for him. He also led investigators to the remains of victims whose locations had not previously been known, providing details about the San Gabriel Mountains locations where 4 of the 5 victims had been disposed of. This is a moment in the case that generates complicated responses, and it is worth sitting with those complications honestly. The cooperation of Roy Norris provided law enforcement with information they might not otherwise have obtained. It allowed the families of the victims to recover remains, to have something physical to bury, to have a location to grieve over. It also meant that a man who had participated in the murder of 5 young women would spend his life in prison rather than face the sentence that the nature of his crimes might otherwise have demanded. These two realities exist simultaneously and cannot be fully reconciled. Lawrence Bittaker, by contrast, did not cooperate. He maintained throughout the legal proceedings a posture that investigators and legal observers described as coldly self-interested, not visibly distressed, not expressive of remorse, but calculating, in the sense that he appeared to be constantly assessing the tactical situation and responding to it with whatever approach seemed most likely to serve his interests. He rejected the idea of a plea agreement. He went to trial. The trial of Lawrence Bittaker began in 1981 in Los Angeles. The evidence against him was overwhelming in both quantity and specificity. The photographs, the recordings, the testimony of Roy Norris, and the physical evidence recovered from the mountains together constructed a case that the defense was not, in any practical sense, able to effectively counter. The strategy mounted on Bittaker's behalf focused less on contesting the basic facts, which were too thoroughly documented, and more on questions of mental state, of criminal culpability in a psychological sense, and on procedural challenges. The jury deliberated for a relatively short period and returned a verdict of guilty on 5 counts of murder. Lawrence Bittaker was sentenced to death. The families of the 5 young women sat in a courtroom and heard this outcome. What that moment was for them, what any of this was for them, is something that resists description, and this account will not presume to characterize it. What is documentable is that they had spent more than a year inside an investigation that required them to confront, repeatedly and in formal legal settings, the evidence of what had happened to their daughters. The trial placed that evidence into a public record. It named what had been done. It assigned culpability in the most formal terms available. Whether that process constituted anything approximating justice is a question that belongs to the families first and to broader society second, and this documentary does not presume to answer it on anyone's behalf. What the trial did establish conclusively and permanently was the factual record, the who, the when, the where, and, to the extent that psychology can ever fully answer it, something approximating the why. 2 men had planned these murders while incarcerated. 2 men had executed that plan with deliberation and documentation. The system had released both of them, despite warning signs. 5 young women were dead. The record existed now. It would be consulted for decades. Lawrence Bittaker remained on California's death row for nearly 40 years. He was never executed. He died in his cell on December 13, 2019, at the age of 79 of natural causes. An outcome that generated, in the communities and families connected to the case, responses ranging from relief to a complicated grief over the particular kind of closure that a death sentence, had it ever been carried out, might or might not have provided. California has maintained an execution moratorium for an extended period, and Bittaker's death was part of a broader pattern in which many of the state's condemned inmates have died of age or illness rather than by court-ordered execution. Whether this represents a flaw in the system, a reflection of evolving social values around capital punishment, or simply the slow arithmetic of bureaucratic and legal delay, is a question that does not yield a clean answer. Roy Norris, who received life imprisonment in exchange for his cooperation, remained incarcerated at a California state facility. As of the most recent reliable reporting available for this documentary, he has been denied parole on multiple occasions. The California Board of Parole Hearings has consistently found that he represents an unreasonable risk to public safety, a determination that, given the documented nature of his crimes and the statements he made both during the original investigation and in subsequent parole hearings, the available evidence supports without ambiguity. The case of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris entered a specific kind of afterlife following the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, the afterlife of the case study, the training document, the institutional reference point. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which was in the 1970s and early 1980s in the process of developing the systematic approach to violent crime investigation and criminal profiling that would eventually transform law enforcement's understanding of what it often calls serial violent crime, used this case as a training reference. The tape recording, the audio documentation of what was done to Shirley Ledford, was used for a period as part of FBI training programs, played for new agents to calibrate their emotional and professional responses to extreme material, to ensure that investigators assigned to violent crime cases could function effectively when confronted with evidence of this nature. This detail has generated discussion over the years, and the ethics of using evidence in this way are genuinely complex. The victims and their families were not uniformly informed of or supportive of this use. Shirley Ledford's family, in particular, expressed significant distress upon learning that the recording had been used as a training instrument, and this response reflects something important about the gap that can exist between institutional utility and the human costs borne by the people whose worst moments became institutional material. This gap between how a case is used by systems and institutions and what it means to the people most directly affected by it runs through the aftermath of this case like a fault line. The 5 victims were individual human beings whose names this account has stated and will state again, because their names belong at the center of any accounting of what happened. Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, Andrea Joy Hall, Jacqueline Doris Gilliam, Leah Wilcoxon, and Shirley Lynette Ledford. They ranged in age from 13 to 18. The youngest, Leah Wilcoxon, was in the first years of adolescence. The oldest, Andrea Hall, had just crossed into legal adulthood. All 5 were found, or their remains were eventually recovered, in the years following the arrests. All 5 have graves. All 5 have families who survived them and who have lived for decades with the particular weight that survivors of violent loss carry. The families have rarely sought or received significant public attention, which is itself a kind of choice. The choice to grieve privately in a case that has received sustained public and institutional attention. This account respects that choice and does not presume to characterize the inner life of their grief or their relationship to the legal and institutional proceedings that followed the deaths of their daughters. What the case contributed to, beyond its immediate criminal proceedings, extends across several domains. In the area of criminal law and sentencing, the case became one of a series of high-profile instances in the late 1970s and early 1980s that contributed to a national rethinking of how parole and early release were administered for individuals with documented histories of sexual violence. Norris had been released despite a prior rape conviction and a documented psychological profile that at least some evaluators had flagged as concerning. The political and legislative response to cases of this type, in California and nationally, shifted meaningfully in the years that followed toward more restrictive standards for the release of individuals convicted of sex crimes and toward longer mandatory sentences for repeat offenders. Whether these policy changes have been effective and how they have interacted with other aspects of the criminal justice and incarceration system is a matter of ongoing debate that extends well beyond the scope of this account. What is documented is that the case was among the inputs that drove that policy conversation. In the area of forensic and investigative methodology, the case contributed to the developing understanding of what would come to be called organized offenders. Individuals or pairs who plan their crimes with operational deliberateness, who leave minimal forensic traces by design, and who can be effectively identified only through the accumulation of circumstantial patterns rather than through any single piece of physical evidence. The interagency coordination failures that allowed two concurrent investigations, the missing persons cases and the later murder investigation, to proceed in parallel without connection became part of the institutional argument for the kinds of information-sharing systems that were eventually developed. There are questions this case raises that remain genuinely open. The first is the most fundamental. What precisely produces the alignment between two individuals like Bittaker and Norris? The prison system brought them into contact, but it did not create what they brought to that contact. Both men had extensive prior histories. Both had been evaluated by mental health professionals at various points. Both had been released back into the world by systems that, at the moment of release, determined that the risk they posed was manageable. What does it mean to say that those determinations were wrong, and what would it have required for them to be right? The risk assessment science of that era was considerably less developed than what exists today, and even today it is imperfect. Predicting future violence is genuinely difficult, in part because the base rate of severe predatory violence is low enough that any screening instrument will generate both false positives and false negatives, and in part because the factors that contribute to extreme violence are not always visible in the ways that institutional evaluation processes are designed to detect. This is not an excuse. It is an honest accounting of the difficulty of the problem, offered in the service of understanding rather than exculpation. The second open question concerns what we owe to victims of extreme violence beyond the criminal trial. The case produced convictions, sentences, and a body of institutional learning. It did not produce anything that meaningfully restored what was taken from 5 families. The legal system, as it currently exists, is not designed to restore. It is designed to adjudicate and to punish. Whether those functions are sufficient and what additional frameworks might be necessary to address the human aftermath of extreme crime is a conversation that this case, and others like it, continues to demand. The third question is perhaps the quietest, and in some ways the one that sits most persistently. What do we do as a society with cases that fall outside the range of ordinary human comprehension? The Bittaker and Norris case is sometimes described in law enforcement and forensic contexts as a case that represents something close to a ceiling of documented deliberate cruelty, not because the number of victims was the largest ever recorded, but because of the combination of premeditation, documentation, collaboration, and expressed indifference that characterized it. When something exceeds ordinary comprehension, there is a natural human tendency either to mythologize it or to look away. This documentary has tried to do neither. It has tried to look steadily at what happened, to name the people involved, the victims above all, and to trace the facts as carefully as the available record allows. Not because the facts are comfortable. They are not. But because the alternative, the avoidance that allows comfortable myths to stand in for difficult truths, serves no one, and least of all the memory of Lucinda, Andrea, Jacqueline, Leah, and Shirley. Lawrence Bittaker is dead. Roy Norris is imprisoned. The van is gone. The neighborhoods of the South Bay have changed, as neighborhoods do, absorbing decades of new residents and new daily life until the ordinary present sits on top of the past like a layer of sediment. But the questions the case raises about systems, about warning signs, about the limitations of institutional response, and about what we owe to the people those systems fail, those questions are not sediment. They are, if we are willing to hold them seriously, still very much alive. The summer of 1979 is long past. The questions it left are still here, waiting, as the most important questions usually do, for answers we have not yet found. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Forest, the Cell, and the Man Who Never Stopped. The Case of Boatman, Leo. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a campsite at night, the kind you only notice when you stop talking and let the forest fill in the silence. Pine trees don't make noise the way city streets do. The sounds are softer out there, more deliberate somehow. A branch adjusting, water somewhere finding its way downhill, a fire that has burned down to embers. And in that kind of quiet, you feel something close to safety. Not the safety of locked doors or streetlights, but the older kind. The kind that comes from distance. From being far enough from the world's ordinary troubles that the troubles seem to stop mattering, at least for a night or two. That is what Amber Peck and John Parker were probably feeling on the evening of January 3, 2006, when they settled into their campsite at a place called Hidden Pond, inside the Ocala National Forest in north-central Florida. They were both 26 years old. They were students at Santa Fe Community College in Gainesville. They were the kind of people whose friends would later describe them with the kind of warmth that tells you something real. Not the polished grief language of press releases, but the honest, stumbling kind of words people use when they are trying to explain why someone mattered. John Parker was, by all accounts, an avid outdoorsman. This was his kind of place. The forest wasn't something he had to convince himself to enjoy. It was somewhere he belonged. And here is the thing that stays with you if you sit with this case long enough. They were not doing anything careless. They were not reckless. They were not in a dangerous part of a dangerous city. They were camping in a national forest, on a trail in the Juniper Springs area, beneath trees that had been growing for decades, under a sky that had no reason to feel threatening. They had every reason to believe that the distance between themselves and harm was vast and absolute. It was not. What found them that night was not random chaos or a sudden accident or any of the things we usually tell ourselves explain tragedy when it visits people who did not deserve it. What found them was a 19-year-old man named Leo Lansing Boatman. A man who had stolen a rifle, boarded a bus, hitchhiked to a campsite, and made a decision that not one reasonable person alive could fully explain then or now. And the thing that makes this case unlike so many others is not just what happened that night. It's what happened after, because Leo Boatman did not stop. Even behind bars, even stripped of freedom, even watched by guards and cameras and layers of institutional control, he did not stop. And that fact alone forces a question that no courtroom has ever fully answered. What do you do with a person like that? This is the story of Leo Boatman, and it begins, as most stories do, long before anyone died. Leo Lansing Boatman was born on July 20th, 1986, in Florida. The circumstances of his birth were not ordinary ones. He was delivered in a local psychiatric hospital, where his mother was confined at the time. His biological father's identity has never been publicly established. From the very first moment of his life, Leo Boatman existed in a space where the institutions meant to protect him were already, in some fundamental way, failing. His mother, who was dealing with serious mental health problems, was unable to care for him. She later drowned, a detail that surfaces in accounts of Boatman's background with a kind of quiet devastation, not because it explains anything on its own, but because it adds to the picture of a child who grew up in a world where the people who were supposed to anchor him were themselves adrift. He was placed into foster care. And this is where the story becomes harder to tell without some recognition of the systems that surrounded him. His first foster placement was reportedly abusive. His second, with a family in St. Petersburg, was no better. Sources that emerged years later indicated that this same foster family had been reported for abuse by multiple children in their care. Allegations included that the foster father had starved the children in his home and subjected them to prolonged physical punishments. forcing them to sit in chairs for extended periods or perform squat jumps as a form of discipline. These were not the quiet inadequacies of a difficult household. They were, by most accounts, a systematic cruelty. When Leo Boatman was 10 years old, a juvenile judge assigned a guardian ad litem to his case, a court-appointed advocate named Steve Schick. Schick was a single man in his 50s with no biological children of his own. By his own account, he came to care for Leo deeply. The relationship that developed between them became, according to Schick himself, something close to a father-son bond. He wanted to adopt Leo. He pursued the legal channels to make that happen. But Leo kept running from foster homes, from the rules, from the structure that Schick was trying to provide, and the state eventually halted the adoption process. Years later, after everything had happened, Schick drove an hour through a heavy rainstorm to speak to a judge, an author who was writing about crossover children in the juvenile justice system. He told her, "I still consider myself his father." He blamed the child welfare system. He blamed the juvenile justice system. He believed that Leo had been failed at every level before he ever had a chance to fail anyone himself. That belief is not without evidence. But it also does not resolve the question of what Leo Boatman chose to do with the chances that did exist. From the age of 12 to 19, Boatman spent the better part of 7 years cycling through the juvenile justice system in Florida. His charges over that period were varied and escalating. Escape, robbery, carrying a concealed weapon, battery, assault on prison guards. He was eventually housed in the Omega Juvenile Prison, one of the state's high-security facilities for juvenile offenders. By the time he was released in August of 2005, he had spent nearly his entire adolescence inside institutions. The world outside, ordinary, unstructured, without guards and schedules and clear walls, was not a place he knew how to inhabit. He was 19 years old. He was living in a mobile home park in Largo, Florida, on Clearwater Largo Road. He had a job. He was washing dishes at a Hooters restaurant. This detail is not mentioned to diminish him or to underscore irony, but because it matters, it tells you something about the texture of his daily life in those months after release. He was not unemployed. He was not entirely without routine. He was, by the ordinary external measures, doing what people in his situation were supposed to do. Staying out of trouble, working, staying housed. But something was building. Something that his brief months of relative stability were not enough to contain. On New Year's weekend, 2005 rolling into 2006, Leo Boatman stole an AK-47 rifle from a friend of his uncle's. He did not steal it in a moment of panic. He did not steal it for money. He took it and he boarded a bus and he traveled north. He hitchhiked. He made his way into the Ocala National Forest, one of Florida's largest national forests, nearly 400,000 acres of longleaf pine and scrub oak and spring-fed rivers, a place beloved by hikers and campers and people who wanted, precisely, to be away from the world for a little while. The Juniper Springs area, where Amber and John had set up their campsite at Hidden Pond, is known for its natural beauty. It is the kind of place that appears on postcards, in trail guides, in the kind of travel recommendations that make people feel like there are still places that belong to the quiet version of life. Amber Marie Peck was 26. She was a Santa Fe Community College student. Her parents, David and Glenda Peck, would later describe a daughter who was thoughtful and full of life, someone whose values and character informed even the grief that would follow her death. John M. Parker was also 26, also a Santa Fe student. He had the kind of love for the outdoors that made places like the Ocala National Forest feel like home. He was, friends said, the kind of person who could make anyone feel at ease in the woods. On the night of January 3, 2006, they were there. And so was Leo Boatman. What happened on that trail, in that quiet, in that forest that should have been nothing but safe, is the foundation upon which everything that follows was built. Not just the legal consequences, not just the headlines, but the larger, stranger, more troubling question of what it means when a person decides that violence is not a last resort, not a desperate act, but something they were moving toward deliberately. Something they wanted. Because years later, Leo Boatman would say, and this is documented, this is on record, that he wanted to be a serial killer. He was 19 years old. and the forest was quiet. The bodies of Amber Peck and John Parker were discovered on January 7, 2006, 3 days after they were killed. The discovery came not through a routine patrol or a random encounter, but because a family member grew concerned. Someone who knew one of them, who knew they had gone to the forest, who noticed that too much time had passed without word. That family member found one of the couple's SUVs still parked at the trailhead and alerted authorities. Marion County deputies followed the trail inward. What they found at Hidden Pond would trigger an investigation that moved faster than many expected. The leads began to accumulate almost immediately. A hitchhiker had been picked up in the area around the time of the murders. The driver who had given him a ride remembered enough to help investigators trace a path. That trail led to a motel in Silver Springs, where the hitchhiker had spent a night. The motel clerk, following standard procedure, had photocopied the man's driver's license when he checked in. The name on that license was Leo Boatman. Investigators from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the Marion County Sheriff's Office moved quickly. They questioned Boatman and learned about the stolen rifle, an AK-47 that he had taken from a friend of his uncle's over the New Year's weekend and had apparently returned after coming back to Largo. The weapon was recovered. It was flown to FDLE crime laboratories in Jacksonville, where forensic analysis confirmed it as the firearm used in the double murder at Hidden Pond. On January 10, 2006, Leo Boatman was arrested. He was initially booked into the Pinellas County Jail on charges of illegal possession of a firearm and grand theft, the most straightforward charges available at the time, and was then transferred to Marion County as the murder investigation formalized. On January 27, 2006, a Marion County grand jury indicted him on 2 counts of first-degree murder with a firearm. Under Florida state law, that charge carried the maximum sentence of death. The investigation drew significant public attention. Marion County Sheriff's spokeswoman Susan Lavoti confirmed the basic facts to the press. David and Glenda Peck, Amber's parents, attended a press conference at the sheriff's office alongside investigators. Photographs from that day show them leaning into each other in the way that people do when they are holding each other upright. They were not performing grief. They were living inside it. What followed was a legal process that stretched into 2007. On July 30th of that year, Leo Boatman entered a plea of guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. The plea came with a critical condition. The prosecution agreed to remove the death penalty from the table. According to State Attorney Brad King, the decision to accept the plea and forego capital punishment was made in direct response to the wishes of the victims' families. Amber Peck's parents stated explicitly that their daughter would not have wanted her killer to be executed. John Parker's family asked for a swift resolution, one that would allow them to begin some version of moving forward. The court honored those wishes. Leo Boatman was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 20 years old. He began serving his sentence at the Cross City Correctional Institution in Dixie County. And it was here, behind bars, under the watch of correctional officers, stripped of nearly every freedom a person can have, that the pattern that would define his life continued to develop. In 2009, Boatman targeted a fellow inmate at Cross City. A 34-year-old man named Mark Apicella, who went by the nickname Applesauce, and was incarcerated for theft, organized fraud, and cocaine possession. Boatman hung Apicella with bed sheets and forcibly administered blood pressure medication to him until officers intervened. Apicella survived. When asked why he had done it, Boatman reportedly offered an explanation that is difficult to process in its simplicity. He was upset that Apicella received more mail than he did. Boatman himself disputed any intent to kill. Apicella told authorities otherwise. Boatman was convicted of attempted second-degree murder and received an additional 7 years added to his existing double life sentence. 7 more years, added to the life he would already never outlive in a cell, for attempted murder over prison mail. The psychological picture that was forming by this point was not a simple one. This was not a man whose crimes could be neatly filed under desperation or circumstance. The forensic history, the juvenile record, the escalating violence, the deliberate nature of the Ocala murders, And now the prison assault told a story about a person who did not experience the internal breaks that most human beings have. The moments when most people pause, reassess, pull back from the edge, those moments did not seem to register for Leo Boatman in the same way. He was transferred. He moved through the Florida Department of Correction system, from institution to institution, as inmates with his profile often do, partly as a management tool, partly as a consequence of his behavior. By August 2010, he was housed at the Charlotte Correctional Institution in Punta Gorda. It was there that on August 18, 2010, he killed his cellmate. Ricky A. Morris was 27 years old. He was serving time at Charlotte when Boatman attacked him in their shared cell, beating him and slamming his head against the concrete floor. Morris died from his injuries. The charge that followed was third-degree murder. Boatman received 15 more years in prison, stacked onto a sentence that already had no end. By the time of the Morris conviction and sentencing in 2013, Leo Boatman had accumulated an almost surreal legal history. 2 life sentences for the 2006 Forest murders, 7 additional years for the 2009 attempted murder, and 15 more years for the 2010 killing of Ricky Morris. He was 27 years old and he had killed 3 people. And he was still alive. He was still breathing. He was still thinking. He was still, by all accounts that would later emerge, capable of forming plans. The Florida corrections system manages thousands of inmates. It manages men who have committed terrible things and who remain inside for the rest of their lives. The system is not designed for rehabilitation alone, it is also designed for containment. And the question that would hover over the next decade of Leo Boatman's incarceration was a quiet but serious one. Could he be contained? Were their walls high enough, protocols strict enough, oversight thorough enough to prevent a man with his history from finding another opportunity? The answer would arrive in 2019, and it would be the most deliberate, most calculated, and most disturbing act of Leo Boatman's documented life. By the time 2019 arrived, Leo Boatman had been incarcerated for 13 years. He was 32 years old. He had spent more of his life inside institutional walls than outside them. The world he had briefly occupied in Largo, the mobile home park, the dishwashing job, the bus rides through Florida, was a more distant memory than his years of juvenile detention, his years of adult prison, his cellmates and his crimes and his transfers between facilities. He was housed at Florida State Prison, one of the state's oldest and most secure correctional facilities, located in Bradford County near the town of Rayford. Florida State Prison is not a place people go when the system believes they can be managed anywhere less restrictive. It houses some of the state's most dangerous inmates, including many on death row. It is, by design, a place of maximum control. It is also, by consequence of that design, a place of immense pressure for everyone inside it. Boatman had been placed in close management confinement. This is a level of restriction within the Florida system that limits an inmate's movement, social contact, and access to general prison activities. It is used for inmates who have demonstrated that they cannot safely participate in the general population. It is, in every practical sense, isolation with institutional clothing. Boatman wanted out of it. He had requested a review that would allow him to return to the general prison population. That request was denied. And here is where the logic that lives inside Leo Boatman, if it can be called logic, becomes difficult to follow and impossible to justify. Rather than waiting, appealing, accepting the decision, he began to plan. William Chapman was a fellow inmate at Florida State Prison. He was 43 years old. He had been sentenced to 9 years for theft-related crimes in Ormond Beach, breaking into a woman's home, stealing property valued at around $6,000. He was, by the timeline of his sentence, approaching release. He had less than a year remaining before he was scheduled to walk out of Florida State Prison and return to the world outside. Less than 1 year. He could see the end. Boatman's accomplice in what followed was a man named William Edward Wells III, known in certain criminal circles by the name the Monster of Mayport. Wells had already been convicted of killing his wife and 4 others in a trailer near Naval Station Mayport in Jacksonville in 2003, as well as an additional prison murder in 2011. He was serving multiple life sentences. He had nothing to lose in any conventional sense, and whatever bond had formed between him and Boatman inside the walls of Florida State Prison was one built in the space where ordinary social constraints had long since ceased to apply. On July 5, 2019, in a prison day room at Florida State Prison, Leo Boatman and William Wells attacked William Chapman. What the security camera footage captured, footage that was later reviewed extensively by investigators, prosecutors, and the courts, was an assault that lasted approximately 12 minutes. They used a ligature. They used 2 handmade shanks. Other inmates were present. As correctional officers became aware of what was happening and attempted to intervene, Boatman moved to the door and blocked it. For 12 minutes, William Chapman, a man with less than a year left on a sentence for property crimes, a man who had harmed no one physically, a man who was almost free, was killed while his would-be rescuers were held back by the man doing the killing. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the Florida Department of Corrections launched a joint investigation. The video evidence was, by all accounts, unambiguous. The planning was evident. This was not an impulsive act. It was premeditated. It was coordinated. And when Boatman later spoke about it to investigators, he offered 2 explanations. The first, he was angry about the denial of his close management review. The second, Chapman had made a sexual advance toward him. The court would ultimately place limited evidentiary weight on these claimed provocations given the planned, extended, and systematic nature of the killing. The case went to Bradford County for trial. Boatman was convicted by a jury of first-degree premeditated murder and possession of a weapon by a state prisoner. He then made an unusual choice. He waived his right to have the jury determine his sentence, asking instead that a judge decide. His attorney presented testimony about Boatman's traumatic upbringing, his mental health history, the circumstances of a childhood that had never been ordinary and often been cruel. The judge listened. The defense's case was not without substance. The record of Boatman's early life, of the abuse and the institutional failures and the mother who died before he became a man, was real and documented and genuinely difficult. But the judge also weighed for aggravating factors. Among them, the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, and the murder was cold, calculated, and premeditated. These are specific legal findings, not rhetorical flourishes. They require evidence. The judge found that evidence present and compelling. On November 10, 2022, Judge James M. Callaw sentenced Leo Lansing Boatman to death for the murder of William Chapman. Wells received a life sentence for his role in Chapman's death, a distinction that turned on various legal and procedural factors but that resulted, in any practical sense, in 2 men who had committed the same act receiving different punishments from a system that must somehow quantify the unquantifiable. For the families of Amber Peck and John Parker, the 2022 sentencing was a complicated moment. They had explicitly asked, back in 2007, that Boatman not be executed. Their wishes had been honored at the time. Now, 15 years later, those wishes were not legally operative in a new case involving a different victim. The sentence handed down for William Chapman's murder did not undo or override anything from 2007. It was its own legal proceeding involving its own facts, its own victim, its own outcome. William Chapman's family had no say in the 2007 sentencing. They hadn't needed to be involved then. They were deeply involved now, navigating a grief that carried the particular weight of lost almost free, almost out, almost done with all of it. In October of 2024, the Florida Supreme Court issued its ruling on Leo Boatman's appeal of his death sentence. The court reviewed each of his claims in turn. Boatman's defense had argued, among other things, that the trial court should not have found him competent to stand trial. A claim rooted in his history of mental health issues, his traumatic background, and the psychological assessments that had been conducted over the years. The defense also raised questions about the constitutionality of Florida's death penalty scheme and argued that Boatman's serious mental illness should exempt him from capital punishment. The Florida Supreme Court denied each claim. The conviction was affirmed. The death sentence was affirmed. The opinion released on October 17, 2024, was methodical and detailed, working through the legal arguments one by one and finding none of them sufficient to overturn what the lower court had decided. As of 2025, Leo Lansing Boatman is incarcerated on death row at the Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. He is 38 years old. The timeline for execution in Florida varies considerably. Death row inmates often wait years or even decades before their sentence is carried out, as appeals are exhausted and legal processes run their course. Boatman's legal journey may not be finished, even now. Post-conviction remedies, federal appeals, ongoing mental health arguments, the machinery of capital case law does not stop simply because a state Supreme Court has spoken. William Wells, his accomplice in the Chapman murder, is also serving a life sentence. Wells's name, the Monster of Mayport, had already been attached to a documented history of violence before he and Boatman encountered each other inside Florida State Prison. The convergence of two men with such histories in the same space at the same time raises questions about how correctional facilities manage their most dangerous populations. Questions that do not have easy answers and that institutions rarely discuss publicly. The case of Leo Boatman sits at an uncomfortable intersection of several conversations that American society has been having for a long time and has not resolved. There is the conversation about the juvenile justice system, about what happens to children who enter it young and leave it late, who spend their most formative years inside institutional settings with limited access to the kind of consistent, loving adult presence that developmental psychology identifies as essential to healthy growth. Steve Schick, Boatman's guardian ad litem, wanted to give him that. The state stopped it from happening. That fact does not excuse what Boatman did. It does complicate the story of how he became capable of it. There is also the conversation about what prison is for. Leo Boatman entered the adult correctional system at 20 years old with 2 life sentences. The expectation, the legal and practical expectation, was that he would remain inside for the rest of his natural life. The system was supposed to contain him. It did not. Twice within a decade, while serving a life sentence that should have meant he would never again be in a position to harm someone, he found that position anyway. Ricky Morris is dead. William Chapman is dead. Neither of them was supposed to be vulnerable in the way that they were. Neither death was supposed to be possible within the framework of a system designed precisely to prevent such things. The Florida Department of Corrections has faced ongoing scrutiny about conditions within its facilities, about understaffing, about the management of violent offenders within the general and specialized populations, about the adequacy of oversight. These are institutional conversations, and they are uncomfortable ones because they force a reckoning with the gap between what we say a prison is supposed to do and what it actually does. For the families of the 4 people Leo Boatman killed, and for the family of the man he nearly killed in 2009, none of these institutional conversations bring comfort or resolution. David and Glenda Peck lost their daughter on a campsite trail in a national forest in January 2006. They asked, in 2007, that the man responsible not be executed. It was an act of extraordinary grace, rooted in their belief that their daughter would not have wanted it. That request was honored then. It is not honored now in the sense that the legal system has since, in a different proceeding, arrived at a different place. The Pecks did not ask for any of this. Amber did not ask for any of it. John Parker's family asked for a swift end to the proceedings in 2007. They got one. Whether that end has felt like resolution in the years since is not something that can be answered from the outside. Ricky Morris was 27 when he died in a shared cell at Charlotte Correctional Institution. He had a life outside those walls before his own crimes brought him inside them. His death received relatively little public attention compared to the 2006 Forest murders. Partly because it occurred inside a prison, partly because the legal outcome was a charge of third-degree murder rather than first-degree, and partly because the story of people who die inside correctional institutions rarely receives the same sustained attention as crimes committed in the world outside. That asymmetry is worth noticing. William Chapman was 43 and had less than a year left on a sentence for property crimes when Boatman and Wells killed him on July 5, 2019. He had broken into a house. He had stolen belongings. He had been convicted and sentenced and was serving his time. He was not a dangerous man by institutional classification. He was not a threat. He was close enough to the end that he could have, in ordinary circumstances, been planning for what came next. That he was killed when he was that close to out carries a particular weight that is hard to articulate and impossible to dismiss. In 2025, a true crime documentary series called World's Most Dangerous Prisoners reenacted key elements of Boatman's case, bringing renewed public attention to a story that had largely receded from national view in the years between the 2007 sentencing and the 2022 death penalty ruling. What remains after all of it? The crimes, the trials, the sentences, the appeals, the death row waiting, is a collection of questions that courts and documentaries and psychological analyses have not fully resolved. What does it mean when the system designed to protect children fails them completely and one of those children later kills? Who bears responsibility for that failure? Does it change how we think about what he did, or only how we think about what was done to him? Can both be true simultaneously? That a person was failed catastrophically by institutions that should have protected them, and that the person still bears full moral and legal responsibility for the choices they made afterward? Can a person who says openly on record that they wanted to be a serial killer, can that person be understood at all? Not excused, not exonerated, but understood in the way that understanding is supposed to be the prerequisite for prevention. And what about the others? The people inside that system, the people passing through facilities like Cross City and Charlotte Correctional and Florida State Prison, the people who were unfortunate enough to be housed near a man whose internal world operated by rules that no institution had ever managed to reach. Leo Boatman is on death row. The appeals process continues its slow movement through the courts. Somewhere in Union Correctional Institution, in Rayford, Florida, he is 38 years old and waiting. Whether he waits in anything like reflection, or whether that capacity was one of the first things taken from him in a psychiatric hospital in 1986 before he was old enough to know what he was losing, is something that no document and no court record can say with certainty. What is certain is simpler and harder. Amber Peck was 26. John Parker was 26. Ricky Morris was 27. William Chapman was 43 and had less than a year left. They are gone. The forest is still there, in north-central Florida, the longleaf pines still growing, the springs still running clear over limestone. People still camp at Juniper Springs. They still settle in at night and let the quiet close around them like something safe. They do not know, most of them, what happened at Hidden Pond in January of 2006. They do not need to, but it happened. And the knowledge of it, the knowledge of how ordinary safety can be interrupted by something it never saw coming, lives somewhere in the history of that place, in the silence between the trees, in the particular kind of stillness that fills a campsite after the fire goes low and the talking stops. That knowledge does not go anywhere, and neither does the grief. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.